Tonight, we begin with a development that U.S. officials had feared, Middle Eastern analysts had warned about, and Israeli defense strategists had quietly prepared for: an escalation that unfolded not over weeks or months, but in 72 hours. 72 hours that brought Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian to the podium with what he called a final ultimatum. 72 hours that saw Israeli airstrikes penetrate deeper into Iranian-controlled territory than at any point this year. 72 hours that forced Washington to mobilize carrier strike groups in a show of force not seen in the region since the opening days of Operation Iraqi Freedom. What Israel did early Thursday morning crossed a line that Tehran had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, President Pezeshkian did not hesitate. He responded with defiance, with precision, and with a warning so direct that even seasoned diplomats in Washington called it unprecedented. For 9 months now, there had been signals, not from official press releases, not from formal diplomatic channels, just signals that Iran was preparing something fundamentally different in its approach to Israel. Iran has been aggressive, yes, but they have been calculated in their aggression. Their moves have followed a certain rhythm, a cadence, almost a predictable script. But what set off alarm bells in Tel Aviv and Washington this past week was that the rhythm went silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor Iranian military communications know the indicators: the increased chatter between IRGC commanders and Hezbollah liaisons, the movement of precision-guided missiles from depots in western Iran toward Syrian storage facilities, the sudden repositioning of air defense batteries around Natanz and Fordo, the abrupt cessation of all public statements from Supreme Leader Khamenei's office. All of that went quiet. And whenever Iran goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. Tehran had been broadcasting strength through proxies: Hezbollah firing rockets from southern Lebanon, Houthi rebels attacking shipping lanes in the Red Sea, Iraqi militias launching drones at U.S. bases. But in the last 2 weeks, those operations slowed, not stopped, slowed, just enough for Israeli intelligence to notice. Just enough for the Mossad to brief Prime Minister Netanyahu that something had shifted in Tehran's calculus. What they didn't know was whether Iran was preparing a direct strike, consolidating for a propaganda victory, or simply recalibrating after recent losses. Early Thursday morning, Israeli defense forces detected what they described as multiple high-value targets being relocated to hardened facilities, including centrifuge components that had not been moved in over 14 months. These are the kinds of assets that Iran only relocates when they are signaling something very specific: imminent escalation, preparation for retaliation, or insurance against preemptive strikes. Western intelligence observers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Iran was changing posture. And when a nuclear threshold state shifts posture without explanation, even by incremental measures, Washington and Tel Aviv pay attention. The movements weren't just nuclear-related. Satellite imagery analyzed by the Institute for Science and International Security showed Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps naval assets being dispersed from Bandar Abbas, the primary port for Iran's fast attack craft and mine-laying vessels. Dispersal is a defensive tactic. It protects assets from being destroyed in a single strike. But it's also an offensive preparation, spreading forces across multiple launch points to complicate enemy targeting. Israel had seen this pattern before. In April 2024, just days before Iran launched over 300 drones and missiles at Israeli territory, the question wasn't whether Iran was preparing something. The question was whether Israel would wait to find out what. The Security Cabinet meeting convened by Prime Minister Netanyahu. Wednesday night was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Cabinet members leaving the session described Israel's intelligence assessment as credible, time-sensitive, and perhaps most importantly, actionable in a way that previous Iranian threats had not been. But deterrence only works if the target hesitates. Iran did not. In fact, their defiance this week was among the most direct we've seen in modern Israeli-Iranian relations. Here's what we know. Within 6 hours of the cabinet meeting concluding, Israeli Air Force F-35I Adir stealth fighters launched precision strikes on multiple targets across Syria and western Iraq. These weren't the typical strikes on weapons convoys moving through the Damascus countryside. These were bunker-penetrating munitions, systems that Israel only deploys when they are preparing to destroy deeply buried, high-value targets. The targets included command and control facilities used by the IRGC Quds Force, ammunition depots storing Iranian-supplied precision munitions, and at least one site near Deir ez-Zor that Western intelligence believes was housing drone assembly operations directly managed by Iranian personnel. Israel struck before Iran could finish whatever it was preparing. They hit infrastructure, they hit logistics, they hit personnel that were likely preparing the next phase of operations against Israeli cities. Thursday afternoon, Iranian state media confirmed that Israeli strikes had killed at least 11 people on Syrian soil, including what Tehran acknowledged were military advisors from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Israel didn't respond before Iran could mobilize. They responded while Iran was mobilizing. They hit the Quds Force Coordination Center outside Damascus. They hit the ammunition storage facility near Al-Bukamal. They hit forward operating positions that were likely preparing to support Hezbollah's next rocket barrage into northern Israel. In other words, Israel targeted Iran's operational capacity, not just its symbolic presence, the infrastructure that would have made the next escalation operational. This is what made Washington's subsequent warnings so urgent. Iran's military buildup in Syria wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. It represented the kind of staging that could enable a multi-front assault on Israel if left unchecked, and Israel, understanding that fully, responded with force. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't hit civilian areas to send a message. They didn't target Syrian government positions to complicate diplomacy. They hit Iranian logistics hubs. They hit Iranian personnel. They destroyed the very infrastructure Iran had spent months quietly building. The strikes were so precise that one senior Israeli official, speaking to Haaretz under anonymity, said the operation had been planned for weeks, waiting only for the right intelligence trigger to justify execution. That trigger came when Mossad intercepted communications suggesting Iran was days away from completing what one analyst called the most significant forward deployment of offensive capabilities since 2018. And here's where the story becomes even more volatile. Western intelligence officials now believe that Iran's latest buildup was designed to test the resolve of Israeli leadership after months of domestic political turmoil and strained relations with the Biden administration. Iran wanted to see whether Israel would hesitate, whether Washington would restrain Netanyahu, whether public fatigue with conflict would create political space for Iran to advance positions without consequence. But instead, the opposite happened. Israel didn't hesitate. They launched one of the most comprehensive preemptive operations against Iranian positions in Syria and Iraq that we've seen in over 2 years. Strikes that were so precise, so coordinated, that even Iran's normally aggressive state media initially struggled to formulate a coherent response. You don't get Tehran's attention easily, but Thursday morning, Israel did. Defense analysts speaking with the Washington Institute under anonymity described Iran's Syria strategy as escalation management, a way to increase pressure on Israel without crossing thresholds that would provoke full retaliation. But Israel proved Thursday that they remain both willing and capable to define those thresholds themselves. Their strikes were not only preemptive, they were calibrated so precisely that they destroyed Iranian assets without triggering Syrian air defenses or killing Syrian military personnel in a way that would force Damascus into the fight. That distinction matters because it shows Israel is not seeking a wider war. It shows that Israel is not operating recklessly. They are managing escalation, not surrendering to it. They are setting boundaries, not waiting for others to set them. As reports continued coming in throughout Thursday and Friday, we learned more about the scale of Israel's response. Israeli F-35s carried out at least 7 separate strikes across 3 Syrian provinces, forcing Iranian personnel to evacuate facilities they had occupied for over 18 months. Israeli intelligence-directed operations targeted a logistics depot near Palmyra that had been resupplied by Iranian transport aircraft in the last 72 hours. Israeli drones operating over eastern Syria reportedly struck a convoy believed to be transporting advanced radar systems used by Iran to coordinate air defense networks protecting Hezbollah positions in Lebanon. This wasn't just another round of mowing the grass. This wasn't just routine interdiction of weapons shipments. This was infrastructure destruction. This was capability denial. And capability denial is the one thing Iran has struggled to prevent since Israel began its shadow war inside Syria in 2013. For every fortified position Iran establishes, Israel has countered with intelligence-driven strikes that degrade Iranian operational freedom without forcing a direct confrontation between Jerusalem and Tehran. Remember, Iran thought Israel was distracted. They thought domestic protests over judicial reform had weakened Netanyahu's political mandate. They thought strained U.S.-Israel relations meant Washington would restrain Israeli military action. But this week, the exact opposite is happening. Israel struck with full operational freedom. Washington mobilized carrier strike groups to deter Iranian retaliation, and Tehran found itself responding to Israeli initiative rather than setting the terms of escalation. What makes this moment so dangerous and so consequential is that Iran's latest buildup happened at a time when President Masoud Pezeshkian is under enormous domestic and factional pressure. Hardliners in the IRGC want immediate retaliation against Israel. Moderates in his cabinet want de-escalation to preserve economic relief from sanctions easing. Supreme Leader Khamenei wants visible strength without risking the nuclear program. Regional proxies want sustained support to maintain pressure on Israel across multiple fronts. Pezeshkian is balancing these demands while managing an economy still crippled by inflation and youth unemployment. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. They're doing it because refusing to act might be more dangerous domestically than acting and risking escalation. Washington's statement, now circulated through diplomatic channels and confirmed by Pentagon Press Secretary Brigadier General Pat Ryder, was designed to signal that the United States is not willing to allow Iran to retaliate against Israel without consequence. Senior administration officials said plainly that Iran's military presence in Syria was inconsistent with regional stability and the sovereignty of the Syrian people. That is diplomatic language for, we know what you're doing, we support Israel's right to stop it, and we're prepared to back that support with military force if necessary. You don't usually hear that tone from the State Department unless something serious is at stake. Meanwhile, President Pezeshkian addressed the Iranian parliament in a forceful, emotional speech Friday afternoon. He said, "The Zionist entity has crossed every red line, violated every norm, and now believes it can strike Iranian forces with impunity." He said, "This will not stand. Iran will respond, and our response will be at a time and place of our choosing." And he said, "We have shown restraint, but restraint is not weakness, and patience is not surrender." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a president who understands just how high the stakes have become and who needs to project strength to survive politically, even if that projection increases the risk of war. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Iran's latest response wasn't isolated to Pezeshkian's speech, along with his parliamentary address. Hezbollah launched over 40 rockets into northern Israel Friday morning, the largest barrage in 3 weeks. Iraqi militias claimed responsibility for drone attacks on U.S. forces at Al-Assad Air Base. Houthi rebels in Yemen renewed attacks on commercial shipping, striking a Greek-flagged tanker in the Red Sea. All of this happened within the same 72-hour window. When Iran moves multiple pieces at once across different theaters, it means something larger is underway. Either coordinated escalation or the beginning of a sustained campaign designed to stretch Israeli and American defensive resources. Intelligence analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Iran is preparing a direct missile and drone strike on Israeli territory, similar to the April 2024 operation, but with improved targeting and saturation tactics. Another is that Iran is attempting to establish permanent offensive infrastructure in Syria that would give Hezbollah and other proxies the ability to threaten Israeli cities without direct Iranian involvement. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Iran is attempting to force a crisis that distracts from nuclear negotiations and consolidates domestic political support around Pezeshkian and the IRGC. But this week, Israel took that card off the table. They didn't wait for UN condemnations. They didn't wait for Washington to mediate. They didn't wait for Iran to complete its preparations. They struck preemptively, decisively, and in a way that forced Tehran to respond to Israeli actions rather than implement its own plan. What we're watching now is a test of resolve. Iran wants to see whether Israel can sustain military operations while managing domestic unrest and international criticism. Israel wants to show that threats to its security will be met with immediate, overwhelming force regardless of political or diplomatic costs. Washington wants to prevent a regional war that could destabilize energy markets and force direct U.S. military involvement. And Tehran wants to prevent the perception that it cannot protect its forces or defend its interests beyond Iranian borders. Tonight, we've heard from Pentagon officials who are now monitoring Iranian naval activity in the Strait of Hormuz. They say Iran has increased patrols of fast attack craft near shipping lanes. They say satellite imagery shows increased activity at Iranian missile facilities near Bandar Abbas. And they say Iran's decision to mobilize additional IRGC naval assets is likely part of a broader signaling strategy intended to demonstrate capability without committing to immediate action. But Israel is not standing down. In fact, Israel is reinforcing. Their response this week, preemptive, precise, and unambiguous, sent a message to Iran that Israel will not wait for permission to defend itself. And it sent a message to Washington that Israel expects American support, not American restraint. As the weekend unfolds, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Iran hoped to achieve with its Syria buildup. But what we do know is that Israel's preemptive action was timely. It disrupted Iranian planning. It degraded Iranian capabilities. And it forced Tehran into a reactive posture at a moment when Iran thought it was setting the agenda. What happens next will depend on what Tehran does in the next 72 to 96 hours. If they choose restraint, this moment will be remembered as a successful Israeli deterrence operation. If they choose retaliation, Washington and Jerusalem have already shown they are postured, coordinated, and prepared. They have shown they are ready to respond. And tonight, for the first time in months, Tehran appears to be calculating. Iranian state media is quiet. Too quiet. And when Iran is quiet, it means they are planning. It means they are choosing their next move carefully, because this week, Iran learned something they have learned many times before but never seem to remember. Israel will not wait. Israel will not ask permission, and Israel will not allow threats to materialize before acting. This story is far from over, but tonight one thing is clear. The rules of engagement between Israel and Iran have shifted. The threshold for Israeli preemption has been redefined. And the question is no longer whether Iran will respond, but whether they can afford to. And we will be here, watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.